This is Jeremy Clammer, and you're listening to 90.1 FM, KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio.
Hello and welcome to Tell Somebody, www.tellsomebody.us. This is your host, Tom Clammer. The views and opinions expressed on Tell Somebody are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the station or anybody else involved with it. If you have any comments or questions on the show, send me an email to mail@tellsomebody.us. Alternative Radio's David Barsamian has just returned from a trip to India and Nepal, and I'm looking forward to getting him live on the phone and hearing about his trip in just a couple of minutes. But I want to toss out a couple of things first. At least 4,374 American women and men in uniform have been killed thus far in the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, at least 972 in Afghanistan. And since last week's show, approximately 900 Americans have died unnecessarily, prematurely, due to lack of health insurance. The University of Missouri-Kansas City will be having part one of a three-part community conversation on national health care this Saturday, January 30th, 9:30 to 11 a.m. at the UMKC School of Law, 500 East 52nd Street in Kansas City, Missouri. That's 52nd Street just east of Oak, in the E. Thompson courtroom. There will be a moderated panel discussion. I've got a link to a lot more information on that up now at www.tellsomebody.us. In his 2008 book, The Political Economy of Media, Professor Robert McChesney wrote, "Currently or in the near future, any number of cases are and will be working their way through the court system that would seek to prohibit any government regulation of political campaign spending, broadcasting, and commercial speech on the grounds that such regulation would violate citizens and corporations' First Amendment rights to free speech or free press. Each case raises quite distinct constitutional issues concerning the First Amendment, but they share the common effect of protecting the ability of the wealthy and the powerful few to act in their self-interest without fear of public examination, debate, and action." Close quote. Well, Bob, you certainly called that one right. Last October, and again in December on Tell Somebody, I talked about a court case called Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, and why it was a huge big deal that the Supreme Court, under corporate activist Chief Justice Roberts, had expanded this relatively obscure case about the attempted swift boating of Hillary Clinton's presidential bid into an opportunity to overturn over 100 years of precedent on corporate election spending. As most of you know by now, a decision in that case was handed down last Thursday morning. That same afternoon, Public Citizen held a telephone press conference call with the president of Public Citizen, Robert Wiseman, Public Citizen Attorney Scott Nelson, who represented McCain and Feingold et al. in that case, Lisa Gilbert of the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, and John Bonifaz, legal director of Voter Action, where they called this a horrible decision that undermines democracy by ruling that for-profit corporations have a First Amendment right to make unlimited expenditures to influence the outcomes of elections. I posted the entire 45-minute press conference online with a link at tellsomebody.us. Here's an excerpt of the conference with a question that I got in.
This is Tom Clammer with KKFI Tell Somebody. Could you give a brief comment on the activist nature of how this case was expanded by a supposedly conservative court majority?
Well, I'll take that on, Rob, if you don't mind. You know, what happened in this case was that Citizens United originally filed a number of narrow so-called as-applied challenges, saying that the restrictions on expenditures couldn't be applied to them because they're mostly a non-profit. They accept only a little bit of money from for-profit corporations, and because what they claimed were the distinctive features of the on-demand video service through which they intended to disseminate their movie, it shouldn't be subject to the law, and also that a full-length movie should not be considered the same as a political advertisement. Those were the kinds of claims that they made, and once the case had been fully briefed in the Supreme Court on that basis, the court itself, on its own initiative, asked the parties to address the very broad question whether its prior precedents should be overruled in such a way that the law would be, as it now is this morning, that all corporations, including for-profit corporations, have an unlimited right to engage in political advertising. As Justice Stevens points out in detail in his dissenting opinion, that's quite contrary to the way the court usually proceeds in addressing constitutional challenges, and really is contrary to the notion that a conservative court should be approaching with caution, upsetting precedents, and making expansive constitutional rulings.
I think that this procedural issue just highlights how far-reaching and radical the court's effort was in Citizens United. To read the dissent is to see it both as regards the process by which the court reached out, as Scott just described, their refusal to consider narrower bases, which would have been more appropriate for deciding the case, apart from deciding it against Citizens United, and then they're just diving in to an expansive creation of rights for artificial entities known as corporations, without any regard for the purpose of the First Amendment, the history of the First Amendment, besides some throwaway lines that Stevens really devastates in his dissent, not describing the historical jurisprudence of the Supreme Court.
Again, the whole conference is online. Links to that audio and much more information on the decision and what to do about it at www.tellsomebody.us. On January 14th, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee of the Kansas City, Missouri City Council approved the latest legislation paving the way for a new nuclear weapons plant in South Kansas City. This was then expected to go to the full council last Thursday, but that afternoon they held it over to this coming Thursday. I have email and voicemail messages for Councilman John Sharp and Councilwoman Kathy Jolly, key proponents on the council of the WMD plant, hoping to get their side of the story on the air, but I have gotten no response from them. Their dismissal of opposition to that plant indicates they not only disagree, but pretty clearly don't even listen at all carefully to the points made by opponents to the plant. Here's a sampling of some of their comments at the committee meeting, along with comments heard on this show 2 weeks ago from Nuke Watch of New Mexico Director Jay Coughlin. In a similar vein, City Councilwoman Kathy Jolly was on the news saying she'd love to be able to wake up some morning and tell her young children that there are no more nuclear weapons. But right now, they're still here, and we have to have them to protect the country. And that's kind of along the lines of the let's leave it to the experts train of thought. But any other reactions to that?
Well, I'm going to begin my response by just telling you, a personal story.
I appreciate your work for peace and for disarmament. I truly do. And anyone who knows me well knows that that is an issue that I care about deeply. But I think as I've pondered this and thought this through myself and looking at things that are important to me, when we look at the world today, we have to be realistic. And even though we continue and we should stay vigilant in wanting to promote peace and disarmament, we have to be real about where we're at today. And unilateral disarmament is not something that we can do.
Our best national security interests lie in getting rid of nuclear weapons. I am not an overnight abolitionist. If I could wave a magic wand and make U.S. nuclear weapons go away while others still had them, I would not do so. That's not going to work.
But where I would differ with some of the folks that oppose this is I do not favor unilateral disarmament. I favor mutual disarmament.
But we can get there. And it has to be multilateral with both declared and undeclared nuclear weapons powers.
Unilateral disarmament is not something that we can do.
This is not sing kumbaya and let's all go home and have a happy, wonderful life. This is about eliminating the gravest strategic national security threat that we face and achieving the goal of ensuring our national and international and global security by getting rid of these barbaric weapons.
But where I would differ with some of the folks that oppose this is I do not favor unilateral disarmament. I favor mutual disarmament.
Let's get rid of them in a disciplined and verifiable, and I'm going to say it again, I'm going to underline verifiable, but let's get rid of them in a disciplined and verifiable manner and make this world safer for everybody.
And unilateral disarmament is not something that we can do.
And again, that is expected to go to the full council day after tomorrow, Thursday at 3 p.m. at City Hall in downtown Kansas City, Missouri. We keep hearing that this project is about jobs. At the January 14th committee meeting, where former City Councilman Jerry Riffle, now an attorney working for the private developer, and former City Councilman Troy Nash, now also working directly for the private developer, Centerpoint Zimmer. Maybe that's the kind of jobs Jolly and Sharp are talking about or even looking forward to. If that's not the case, they should come on the show and tell somebody what they think it's all about. And just today there's a new development related to the plant, something related to the contamination of the old plant. I'll get links to more on that at tellsomebody.us. On with the show. And just today there's a new development related to the plant, something related to the contamination of the old plant. I'll get links to more on that at tellsomebody.us. On with the show.
And that is breaking news. Today, Russ Potasic of NBC Action News has apparently obtained some documents about health risks with the day center on the grounds of the Bannister Federal Complex. We'll stay on top of that, and I'll get more links on Tell Somebody. So stay tuned for that. But now, the main course for this evening, David Barsamian with Alternative Radio, heard here on KKFI every Wednesday at 9 a.m. and alternativeradio.org. Just returned from India and Nepal just a few days ago. He's the award-winning founder and director of Alternative Radio, the independent weekly series based in Boulder, Colorado. David Barsamian, welcome back to Tell Somebody.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's always a pleasure to be on Tell Somebody and my very favorite radio station in Kansas City, KKFI. Greetings to all listeners and supporters of KKFI, Independent Community Radio.
Great to have you on. Appreciate you taking your time, and I like what you just said. So, I was reading your blog a little bit at alternativeradio.org, but tell us some more about your trip to India and Nepal.
Well, I hadn't been to Nepal in decades. I don't want to date myself too much, but I can tell you it's been more than 4 decades since I was last there. And it has undergone a remarkable transformation in terms of the last remaining Hindu kingdom being dismantled. It is now a republic. This was a result of a Maoist-led revolt that culminated in a peace accord in 2006, and then the abolition of the Hindu monarchy shortly thereafter. There were general elections in 2008. To everyone's surprise, including the U.S. State Department, which has the Nepali Maoists as a terrorist group, they won the largest number of votes in Nepal and were part of a coalition government. They've since walked away from the government. There's a complicated internal dispute going on between remnants of the old oligarchy and the Maoists themselves.
And, what's Nepal 101 for some of us? I mean, you've given us a good bit already, but what's the relationship?
The capital city is Kathmandu. The population of the country is about 25 to 30 million. Why does anyone know anything about Nepal? It mostly has to do with Mount Everest and the great mountains of the Himalayas. Many of the world's tallest peaks are located in Nepal. Many Westerners, in particular Westerners, love to go trekking there. I myself, went on a trek for 3 or 4 days near the base camp of Mount Everest. I got as far as Namche Bazaar. I wish I could have gone farther, but I had to get back for a lecture in Kathmandu. It's a desperately poor country. It's a buffer state between China and India. India historically has had great political influence and economic influence in Nepal. There's something like 4 million Nepalis working in India. Nepalis do not need a visa or a passport to enter India, so they form a cheap labor force for India. It's the remittances from these workers, as well as Nepali workers in the Persian Gulf and the Emirates, constitute the largest source of income in the Nepal budget. So it's politically and, ethnically, it's multi-ethnic. It is multilingual, as are all the countries in that region. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Nepal, these are all multi-ethnic, multilingual countries. There isn't simply one Nepal that one can, conveniently fit into a box. It's a very complex ethnic and political structure. It's largely Hindu, but there are many Buddhists in Nepal, and they have influenced the country greatly. There are many tens of thousands of Tibetan Buddhists who fled Tibet after the Chinese takeover in 1959, when the Dalai Lama fled to India. Many Tibetan refugees sought a haven in Nepal, and they are there. I visited with them in the monastery of Bodhnath, right outside of Kathmandu. So it's one of these Shangri-La countries, but one should not romanticize it at all. It's desperately poor. Not only is there a large workforce, as I mentioned, in India and the Persian Gulf Emirates, but you may know about the Gorkhas, the Gurkhas. These are Nepalis who serve in the British Army. They're in Iraq, they're in Afghanistan. So basically a mercenary force. This is a leftover from the colonial period when the British had much influence in Nepal, and they basically rent themselves out to Britain to be part of their military operations.
Wow. And you mentioned it as a buffer between India and China, looking at it on the map, it's kind of a bit on the eastern side, on the northern edge of India.
It's a landlocked country, yeah. It's sandwiched between these two giants. Tibet, China is immediately to Nepal's north. India surrounds Nepal on three sides.
Uh-huh. And, I read, I did a quick read of the latest blog entry I could find at Alternative Radio, and also read recently a piece by Arundhati Roy about India and corporate development and Maoists, and it sounds like some kind of...
Now we're moving across the border from Nepal into India, and it's important for your listeners to know that there isn't much connection between the Maoists in Nepal and the Maoists in India.
Uh-huh.
They may take the name, but they are quite different formations. They have quite different agenda and national aspirations. The Maoists in India and in Nepal, people think of perhaps, Chairman Mao and people running around with little red books and things like that. It's not like that at all. These are, different. We have to understand historical formations in situ, in place, rather than based on things we may have read by Edgar Snow in Red Star Over China 60 or 70 years ago, which kind of romanticized the Maoist revolt in China. So I'm glad you mentioned the Arundhati Roy essay. It's published in its entirety in International Socialist Review. There's an excerpt also in the current In These Times. I don't know which version you saw, but this is a very important essay by one of India's leading intellectual dissidents about what is going on in India in terms of the corporados moving in on mineral-rich lands, seizing those lands with the connivance of the government, and displacing hundreds of thousands of people in the process. There is a major struggle going on in India. This may surprise your listeners, because, India is considered a great success story. If you just read Tom Friedman in the New York Times, for example, it's the most successful example of a developing country in the third world. He's constantly, and others like Charlie Rose, for example, they're always holding up India as a model, as a paragon. This is the way to do it, not the Chinese way, which is authoritarian and totalitarian. In India, it's the world's largest democracy, we're told. Well, the Indian government has been very successful in selling itself to the U.S. and to Europe as, the world's largest democracy, and completely masking over what can only be called, well, let me use Arundhati Roy's own words, a juggernaut of injustices. And interestingly, juggernaut happens to be a Hindi word that is now used in English.
I never knew that.
A juggernaut of injustices that has generated massive revolts throughout central India, revolts in Kashmir, which have been going on and off since 1947, and in the northeast, also since independence in 1947, when India achieved independence from the British Raj. Those struggles in the corners, in the top left-hand corner, if you're looking at a map of India, the top left-hand corner and the top right-hand corner, they have been ebbing and flowing with, many, many casualties. In Kashmir, over 70,000, 80,000 people have been killed. Nobody knows about this here. I mention it to people and I get a blank stare. They just don't, there's no reporting on it virtually. Thousands of people are missing in Kashmir. There's a recent report that, and this is quite independent of the Maoist rebellions in the central part of the country. The Maoist rebellions, what's going on in Kashmir is quite different from what's going on in the central part of the country. When I mean the central part of the country, if you could again look at a map, it includes the states of West Bengal, Jharkhand, Andhra Pradesh, Orissa, and Chhattisgarh. It is in this area where there are various resistances, revolts, uprisings, all called by the Indian government as Maoists, as terrorists, as ultras, but they've been very successful in persuading Washington and its other allies that these are all terrorists. So that's music to Washington's ears. They think that India is on board in this, grand global war on terrorists, completely ignoring the fact that there are enormous economic injustices going on in India that have triggered these revolts, that have generated tremendous opposition. And the government of India in New Delhi has been colluding with major Indian corporations like Mittal, like Jindal, like Tata, like POSCO, like Vedanta, and many others in stealing, grabbing the land, mostly from indigenous Indians called Adivasi. That means indigenous Indians, very poor, dispossessed people who have been extremely disadvantaged by the Indian state, who do not have access to rights, and they're not celebrated by, Human Rights Watch in New York or Amnesty International. These are invisible people, and therefore they are disposable people. And the Indian state, aligning itself with these corporations, all in the name of progress, has been moving in on the lands of these Adivasis. And why are they moving in on these lands, you may ask? Well, they have very valuable mineral and timber resources. These are some of the most densely forested areas of India where the indigenous population, the Adivasi, reside. They also have enormous, and I stress the word enormous, bauxite deposits in the several trillions of dollars, particularly in the state of Orissa. They have enormous iron ore, manganese, and other mineral deposits, diamonds, uranium in these areas. So this is the New World Order, a la India, and people are pushing back. It's very impressive how much resistance there is in India, particularly compared to the United States, where we have all of these advantages here of the internet and the electronic communications and enormous levels of privilege. But when I wrote to Howard Zinn, our great radical historian, author of People's History of the United States, about what was going on in India, how people were fighting back, and these are some of the poorest people on the face of the earth. They're not literate. They haven't been to school. Forget about colleges or universities. But they have organized themselves. And Zinn commented to me in an email that the United States seems like a desert in comparison in terms of resistance to power.
Right. This is Tom Clammer. You're listening to Tell Somebody on 90.1 FM KKFI, Kansas City Community Radio, and we are talking to the award-winning host and director of alternative radio, David Barsamian, just returned from Nepal and India. And David, I think you called it just right when you said we've been fed our vision of India from Tom Friedman and Fareed Zakaria, and real in-depth knowledge of India means you know what the Tata Nano is, and that's about as far as it goes.
Yes, this is you're referring to this mini car, which was, being made now in India for about $2,000 US. This will contribute greatly to already insufferable levels of pollution in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Kolkata, and the other major cities of India, and add to the traffic jams, which are just a normal part now of urban existence. I mean, it's the last thing that India needs, more cars on the road. They need public transportation rather than more cars. But again, the model is the United States, which has perhaps the worst public transportation. I will say our country, I hate to use the word like enjoys the worst public transportation system of any industrialized country on the face of the earth. China is putting us to shame with its massive high-speed railroad network that it's building today. People don't like going to airports. I hate going to airports. I'm going to L.A. In a couple of days. I dread it. You have to get there hours in advance. You have to go through this, incredible search and, pat-downs and security checks and all that. Why don't we, I would love to be able to, get on a train and go to Kansas City or go to L.A. or go to New York, but I can't. It takes forever.
Right.
We don't even have direct connections. Look, I live near Denver, Colorado. Amtrak comes through Denver. If I want to go to California, to San Francisco or L.A., there is no direct train. I have to go to Salt Lake and change. And it takes forever.
Yeah.
I mean,
you
why
can't go
aren't
from Kansas
people
City.
clamoring for that? I know we're going a little bit off topic, but it's something that, I'm very much concerned with. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is I was very interested to hear the commentary just before we went on the air from the city council, and was that Jay Coughlin?
Yes, that was Jay
That
Coughlin.
was Jay?
And
I totally agree with what he says. And the response from the city council woman, I didn't catch her name, was typical. No one is more for peace than I am. I certainly share your values, but we have to live in the real world. What is this real world? What rubbish? Why doesn't just someone, slap these people and wake them up? What real world are you living in? The United States spends $1 trillion a year on its military budget. It is occupying 2 countries. It is bombing a third, in fact, more than. It's bombing Pakistan, it's bombing Yemen, it's bombing Somalia. We have over 735 military bases around the world. Who is threatening the United States? It's the United States that straddles the globe with its military-industrial complex. We need to bring that complex down to a great extent. I'm not advocating pacifism.
Right.
I'm saying, we need to have adequate defense capability to resist any attack on the United States. Why are we in Okinawa? Why are we in Diego Garcia? Why are we in the Persian Gulf? Why does the United States have 12 aircraft carrier battle groups when millions of Americans have no work, have their homes foreclosed or in danger of foreclosure, are filing for bankruptcy, where we have an economic system that is literally falling apart, has disintegrated in the lives of every single listener to this program. Anyone who could hear our voice right now and listening to Tell Somebody has seen the United States disintegrate, devolve from a major industrial manufacturing force to a country that can only make weapons. That is our biggest, export right now. We are the #1 trafficker in weaponry, and that leads a lot of people, like friends of mine in Pakistan, and in Syria and Lebanon, where I also was recently, to believe that the United States loves to foment crises, and loves to provoke conflicts. Why? And you have to see the logic of their thinking. Because they sell weapons. Because then it gives them an excuse to locate a base there. Why don't we have jobs and education for people here instead of, militarizing the entire globe with our, global apparatus, Did you see Avatar?
I have not seen that yet. I've,
well,
of course, heard a lot about it.
Because it's this fictional planet called Pandora, right, where there are these natives, indigenous people, like the Adivasi in India, who are very close to nature. They live with nature, they worship nature, and you have a predatory corporation, clearly American, defended, by American troops, invading this rather peaceful planet. Of course, this is all, kind of idyllic and Edenesque, but nevertheless, it's a good story, and it will help people kind of understand what's going on in India, but also what's going on even here in the United States. You have, a corporate state that is only interested in maintaining profits, that exports its jobs, that outsources just about everything, and has scant interest for humanity and no interest at all in the environment or protecting nature, which should be one of our greatest, charges as citizens of this planet. So I was very interested to hear, the councilwoman talking about, the real world. I think this woman, whoever she is, and the people who think like her, are inhabiting the unreal world, the world of militarism, the world of endless threats that are generated largely by U.S. policy, and can be addressed, and should be addressed. And the other thing I want to say about this, the military-industrial complex, and I think there's going to be there's a proposal for a major weapons plant in Kansas City. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Is that, there's this myth that goes around, it means jobs.
Exactly.
Well, great, everyone is for jobs, but let's get to the real world where that councilwoman does not inhabit. Military contracts, military weapons in particular, nukes, are extremely capital intensive. They are not labor intensive. So this is not like building schools or highways or bridges or any of the or railroads and mass transit, which is badly needed in this country. Those kinds of jobs, those kinds of projects employ many, many thousands of workers. When you're in the military-industrial complex, is extremely capital-intensive, as I said, and it is labor non-intensive. There just aren't that many jobs there. So that's another myth that needs to be, I don't want to use a violent word like exploded, but it needs to be, unmasked. It needs to be revealed.
Right.
So why should we continue with business as usual? Business as usual has brought ruin to the United States. I don't know what the unemployment rate is like in the Kansas City area. I think it's probably very high. The actual unemployment rates in this country today are running close to 18%.
Yeah.
If you include those workers who have been so discouraged that they've dropped out of the labor market, and including those people who are forced to work part-time when they'd rather work full-time. So the whole this whole idea of the unemployment being somewhere around 10%, that's another myth that's repeated over and over again. And, I think it's hovering near, it's moving toward 20%. Those are figures not seen since the 1930s in this country. And again, we have to link all of these things together. Predatory capitalism, as we see in India, where, corporations are ripping off the mineral wealth and displacing hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, putting them into camps, and what was shown in that film Avatar of total disregard for nature, profit über alles. That seems to be the kind of doctrine that has almost taken on theological texture to it.
Absolutely.
It's like a belief system. Are you talking about challenging profits? Well, I'm talking about having a sustainable world so that the people listening to this program, their children and their grandchildren, will have a habitable planet.
Yeah. And, I got 6 directions I want to go all at once. One is the way the right has framed the economic argument on health care, we can't afford health care, but it never comes up how much we're spending on the things you mentioned, the nuclear weapons complex and the bases all over the world and so forth. But that's not discussed much when it's talking about what can we afford to do.
Well,
because we can always afford
that. And which is predominantly right-wing, very much corporate oriented, have been simply scaring the American people with ludicrous charges that this is government-run healthcare system, socialism. We're going to be like the old Soviet Union, Soviet-style bureaucracies. Do you want your health care to be decided by a Soviet-style bureaucrat?
No,
some nameless apparatchik in some ministry in Washington?
No, I want it decided by an insurance company executive that gets a bonus if he can figure out a way to cut me out. That's what I want. Because otherwise it'd be socialism, and that's evil.
Again, using these terms to scare people, I think is reprehensible and is immoral. And I don't know if people realize the level of manipulation that is going on. Whether it's talking about health care or other important issues, whether it's why we need to have this enormous military complex, why we need to maintain nukes, even though Obama has, to his credit, said that ideally he would like to reduce and eventually eliminate nukes. I think that is to his credit. But let's see some implementation of that. There should be an immediate reduction of nukes. We have over 5,000 to 6,000 weapons. Why do we need them? By the way, these are weapons that are unusable. The threats facing the United States today are largely are economic and environmental. They are much more serious than the occasional terrorist attack, as deplorable as they are. But in the long term, you're talking about economic decline and deterioration, and you're talking about environmental degradation, which will ultimately result in the planet being inhospitable to human habitation. I mean, that's pretty serious. Now, those are the long-term threats. It's easy to talk about, bin Laden, bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, they're coming to Kansas City, they're going to take over. None of that's going to happen. This is a lot of fear-mongering that is used. I'm not saying that there isn't a threat, but it should be addressed proportionately. You don't send expeditionary armies to Afghanistan and Iraq and huge navies to the Persian Gulf to fight a small band, excuse me, and I emphasize that, a small band of terrorists. We're talking hundreds, maybe a few thousand people here. We're not talking armies with navies and air forces and tank divisions. Why are expeditionary forces being deployed? Why is Pakistan being bombed? Why is Yemen being bombed? Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. No one is asking these questions. You'll notice in Obama's already leaked State of the Union address that he's going to be reducing a lot of spending, but not for the Pentagon, not for the military. So is this change you can believe in? Is this the change that people voted for on November 4th, 2008?
Well, again, this has been successfully framed by the wrong people, I think. And but on the nuclear threat, and this is not where I'm coming from, but you just came from India, and Pakistan is right there, and you wrote the book about Target Iran. A lot of people are saying we have to. The Soviet Union's gone, but who knows what could change with Russia? Plus, Iran's going to get the nuclear weapon, and Pakistan has it, and they're a bunch of crazy people, and all kinds of rhetoric like this. That we need to protect our American way of life with this with these weapons, which is what I actually heard in one of these hearings related to Kansas City plant about 6 months ago.
Well, that's distressing. I'm sorry, that someone took that particular position, because I think it's a false position. India has nukes. Its neighbor Pakistan has nukes. They have fought at least 3 wars since achieving independence from Britain in 1947. They have fought, numerous border skirmishes. This is a very dangerous situation when you have these kinds of states having weapons of mass destruction. Now, it's very interesting to point out that both India and Pakistan, as well as the most important ally of the United States and the most privileged ally of the United States, that is to say Israel, are non-signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right.
What is the Non-Proliferation Treaty? This was created in the late 1960s, and it sought to create a regime in which ultimately nukes would be eliminated. And Iran was a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I'll now refer to by its acronym, the NPT. These other states, Israel, Pakistan, and India, all allies of the United States today, are not signatories. They are not being held to account. They are not being subjected to inspections by the IAEA based in Vienna, that is the International Atomic Energy Agency, led by the former Nobel Prize winner Mohammed al-Baradei, who's recently retired. And so the U.S. has had a double standard on this particular issue. It itself, the United States itself, is in violation of the NPT, because one of its major provisions is that those states that have weapons should be dismantling them, aggressively,
Right.
and that hasn't been done in any systematic way beyond some cosmetic de-weaponizing, demobilizing of, nukes that have been, that were incredibly obsolete and unusable to begin with. But this whole thing with Iran is used to frighten people, to justify military expenditures, to justify massive U.S. intervention in the Middle East area. I mean, you have to go to the region to see these bases. They're not the size of football fields. They're the size of cities. Mm-hmm. Cities with, air-conditioned complexes and, tennis courts, golf courses, swimming pools, Walmart, Kmart, Burger King, Wendy's, Pizza Hut, Domino's, you name it. Go to the big base, outside of Baghdad called Balad, B-A-L-A-D. I mean, it's a city within itself, even inside, the green zone in Baghdad. Do you think the U.S. is going to abandon those bases? It's very unlikely. I think they're going to stay in Iraq for years to come.
Yeah, I mean, this is the biggest embassy in the world, and most Kansas Cityans don't know that a Kansas City architectural firm designed it and was bragging about it on their website, and then this was still under Bush, and word came from the State Department or someplace to shut up about that and pull that off your website. But Again, there's so many things I wish I could get to with you, but one thing I don't want to miss is a favorite of a lot of KKFIers, and certainly not just KKFIers, but somebody I've had on the phone a couple of times, but you've done, I believe, at least several in-person interviews on your trips, and reading one of your blogs today, I saw that you ran into Vandana Shiva at some small protest in India.
It was very ironic. It was like it was during rush hour. New Delhi gets very, very cold in winter. Not by your standards, of course, but by Indian standards, it gets down to 40, 45, and it's bitterly cold. Delhi is on the edge of the western Rajasthani desert, so there's a cold wind that blows in from the Rajasthani desert. So it's very cold, and Vandana Shiva was on a flyover, that is to say, an overpass during rush hour with a bunch of supporters, including her own sister, who happens to be a medical doctor, and they were protesting, and I joined the protest of some of the things I discussed at the beginning of this interview, the displacement of indigenous peoples from their traditional lands by the corporados who are moving in with government connivance to steal their resources and take the land. So that was what was going on then. It was great to see Vandana. I'm in constant touch with her. I recently did an alternative radio program with her called actually it was about Mahatma Gandhi and his relevance to India today, and how Gandhi influences Vandana Shiva, as well as many other nonviolent civil disobedient activists in India. I know we talked a little bit about the Maoists, who are clearly not Gandhian in their approach, but there is nonviolent civil disobedience also accompanying the actual armed resistance to the predations of the Indian state and its corporate allies.
Mm-hmm. And, anytime you mentioned Charlie Rose earlier, and along with Fareed Zakaria and Tom Friedman and so forth, but anytime I hear Charlie Rose, I think of Vandana Shiva, and I don't mean that as any kind of insult to her, but I think about his Coke commercials or underwriting on his PBS show that give this wonderful, warm image and soft music about Coca-Cola, and then some kind of message about how they're helping get clean drinking water for poor people around the world. I don't remember if they specifically mentioned India or not, but and then I contrast that with what Vandana Shiva and others have said about what Coke's really doing in India, and you know what that says about our media here, even the so-called liberal media.
Well, the liberal media is a joke. Yeah. Charlie Rose himself, particularly on foreign affairs, is one of the most incompetent interviewers I have ever seen. The shallowness of his understanding of international issues is truly breathtaking. Mm-hmm. And I'm choosing my words very carefully here. He knows nothing about the Middle East, South Asia. He knows nothing about U.S. foreign policy, about imperialism. He can't even talk about capitalism in any kind of coherent way. So let's dismiss Charlie Rose. He's not, in my view, a serious journalist. He's an entertainer. He's an infotainer. And you'll notice that the best interviews he does happens to be on cultural issues, very much like Terry Gross on Fresh Air on NPR. When they talk about, music or Broadway shows or Hollywood films or, some other, poetry and things like that, they do fabulous interviews. Why? Because it's easy. There's no cost. There's no threat. No one's going to, no one's going to menace you or send you nasty emails. How dare you attack the United States? You must be anti-American. Why don't you leave this country? Why don't you go back to Russia? Or, et cetera, et cetera. You've heard, I'm sure, all of the kind of epithets that are hurled unthinkingly on people who dissent, on people who have a critical view of the existing system of power and privilege in this country. And so in terms of Coca-Cola, there has been huge resistance in India to Coca-Cola. In fact, in one instance that Shiva was involved in, along with other activists in Plachamada, in the southwestern state of Kerala, the villagers there found that their tap water, the water they were drawing from their wells, was contaminated. And then they were able to connect that with a nearby Coca-Cola plant, which was, first of all, draining an enormous amount of fresh water to make soda. This might interest your listeners. I'm sure many of whom drink sodas, that it takes an enormous amount of fresh water to produce a bottle of Coke or a bottle of Sprite. I hate to give any of them even mention their names because people sound like an advertisement. But, these pop sodas, I think the ratio is something like 3 gallons to 1. It may be even higher. I may be understating it. I'll have to check. I've heard as much as 10 gallons of fresh water to produce 1 gallon of soda.
Yeah.
So they found that Coke was contaminating the aquifer also, and they launched a civil disobedience campaign, which Vandana Shiva later joined, and succeeded in closing the Coca-Cola plant.
Well,
but
David?
Sadly, the plant was able to relocate in another part of that state because people, were persuaded that, it would bring them a few jobs and the like.
Right. Well, I hate like heck to do this, but I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to put out any quick final words you got. It just has gone too quickly. What do you got to say?
Well, so first of all, it's a great pleasure to be on your program. It's one of the, best programs of its kind in the country, and I'm really always glad to talk to you and to talk to KKFI listeners. I hope I can get back to Kansas City soon and hang out with you folks there. But I would suggest that people, not despair, maybe save depression for better times. This is no time to be depressed. This is a time to be active. And you remember Obama said during the campaign, if you want me to do something, you got to push me. So he was kind of throwing down the gauntlet. And, it's not just enough to say, oh, we have the first African-American president in the White House. Isn't that great? He is the president. He's a politician, and he will respond to political pressure. So it's important that people be active and to support community radio KKFI. It's one of the few independent voices in that entire region of the country.
Well, you heard the man, ladies and gentlemen. David Barsamian, award-winning founder and director of Alternative Radio. David, thank you very much for giving us your time just back from that long trip. Thanks a lot. Great.
Sure, my pleasure, Tom.
Take care.
Remember, you can hear David Barsamian's Alternative Radio every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. right here on KKFI. You've been listening to the podcast edition of Tell Somebody, a locally produced weekly public affairs program heard every Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Time on 90.1 FM KKFI in Kansas City, streaming live around the world at kkfi.org. You can subscribe to the podcast for free at the iTunes Store or download MP3s of past shows at tellsomebody.libsyn.com or at tellsomebody.us. KKFI will be having a pledge drive starting Thursday, February 4th. Tell Somebody's pledge drive show will be the following Tuesday, February 9th. While I hope you'll make as generous a donation to the station as you can, and would especially love it if you do it during my show, I really believe it's just as important, if not more so, to help us spread the word about KKFI, to help us broaden our base of support and interaction with the community. Our broadcast goes out to a potential audience well over 1 million. We need more of those folks to get involved with KKFI, to volunteer, to serve on committees, to develop new programs to help us better serve the entire Kansas City metropolitan area and beyond. Please tell somebody about KKFI, your 100,000-watt FM community radio station. And KKFI highly values your feedback. You can email comments about this show or any other show on KKFI to the Programming Committee at kkfi-programming@googlegroups.com, or send me an email to mail@tellsomebody.us. This is your host, Tom Clammer. I'll see you next week on Tell Somebody.